Like World War economics, the fourth lecture will be again on economics. This one is more on philosophy or law and economics, but a heavy dose of philosophy. My goal is to present the views of two different schools when it comes to the question of what is just, what is justice. I first want to present the views that the so-called Austrian school has on the question of what is just, and then I want to, and I should make clear from the outset that I consider this first view a classical view and the correct view, and then I want to present an alternative view that has been developed by Chicago economists, in particular by Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize winner, but as I will show, somebody who thinks very strangely. Let me begin by explaining what I refer to as the problem of social order. Imagine that we would live in the Garden of Eden, in paradise. And in the Garden of Eden, in paradise, we know there exists a superabundance of goods. Whatever we want, all we need is to stretch out our hands and we have whatever we need, whatever we want. There's a superabundance of beer, a superabundance of bananas. Germans care mostly about the beer question. Also the Czechs, of course, also. You will hear tomorrow about Josef Šíma. But whatever it is, it exists in superabundance. Now, if things exist in superabundance, then it is not possible that people can have conflicts over these things. We would not fight over bananas. Whenever I eat a banana, there are plenty of bananas left over for you. So why should we fight? Why should we have conflicts with each other? I don't even have to worry about if I eat something right now, will I have enough tomorrow? Whatever I eat right now has absolutely no effect on the fact that tomorrow there's also a superabundance of things. So very important to recognize, as long as there is superabundance of things, as long as there is no scarcity of things, conflicts between different individuals are not possible. But even in the Garden of Eden, two things are scarce and two types of conflicts can arise. The one thing that does not exist in superabundance, even in the Garden of Eden, is our own physical bodies. I have only one, and you have only one. There's not a superabundance of bodies. And if I want to do something to you, or you want to do something to me, then, of course, if we don't agree what that is that you want to do to me or what I want to do to you, then a conflict arises. And the second thing that is scarce in the Garden of Eden is the standing room on which our body rests. If I want to occupy exactly the same space that you occupy, then automatically a conflict arises. So even in the Garden of Eden, conflicts are possible. Even though not as many conflicts as in the real world, I come to that in a minute, but some sorts of conflicts are possible. And what we then need to do whenever conflicts are possible in order to avoid conflicts is to formulate some rules, property rules, that determine who is the exclusive owner of a scarce resource, so that the exclusive owner can determine what is or is not to be done to a scarce resource. To illustrate this, intuitively, the two rules that we would accept in the Garden of Eden in order to avoid possible conflicts would be these. The first rule is every person is the owner of his own physical body and can do with his own physical body whatever he wants to do. If somebody else wants to do something to you, then he can only do this if he has your consent, if he agrees to it. If I want to do something to your body, then I can only do this if you agree to this. So if we would accept this rule, then in the Garden of Eden, all conceivable conflicts could be avoided. And the second rule that we would intuitively accept is everybody can move around in the Garden of Eden wherever he wants to move, except to those places that are already occupied by somebody else. If these other people then move away someplace else, then we can also occupy that place. But as long as somebody else stands on a certain place, you cannot move there. And with these two rules, it would be possible that all conflicts in the Garden of Eden could be solved, could be avoided, so to speak. Okay, now we come to the real world. And the difference between the Garden of Eden and the real world is simply the fact that in the real world, not just two things are scarce, but all sorts of things are scarce. That is, we do not have a superabundance of millions and millions of different things. And in order to avoid conflicts, we would need property rules, that is, rules of exclusive ownership of scarce resources, of all scarce resources, such that it becomes possible that all conflicts regarding scarce resources can be avoided. Now I want to formulate the four rules that initially will sound intuitively plausible, and I will then give a more rigorous defense of these rules. First, I will simply list the rules that I would think most people would accept without much questioning them as rules applying to the real world, rules suitable to the task of creating social order, avoiding conflict with other people. Incidentally, I did not invent these rules. These rules are ancient rules. Almost all political philosophers and so forth have by and large accepted these rules as serving the purpose that I mentioned, to make it possible that conflicts can be avoided. The first rule is what we refer to as self-ownership. That is a rule that I already mentioned as intuitively plausible for the Garden of Eden. It means nothing else but I am the owner of my body, you are the exclusive owner of your body, you can do with your body whatever you want, and if you want to do something to somebody else, then you need his permission. The second rule tries to regulate how do people acquire property. Again, recall what property is. Property is the right to exclusively control a scarce resource. How do people acquire property in things that were previously unowned? At the beginning of mankind, so to speak, everything outside of our own physical body was, of course, unowned. How do people, in the first place, acquire property in things that were previously owned by no one? And this rule says, basically, first use, first own. This is also sometimes referred to as original appropriation. Or also sometimes referred to as homesteading. The idea of this rule is also quite simple. Whoever was the first one to put some piece of land to some use, whoever fenced in a piece of land, cut trees down, put some seeds in the ground and so forth, whoever did something for the very first time, nobody was there before him, becomes thereby the exclusive owner of this piece of scarce things, of land. And can then determine what is or is not to be done with this scarce resource. He can make allow other people to also make use of it, but he can also exclude other people from using it. This is what property means. You can invite people onto your property, but you can also exclude them from your property if you prefer to do this. The next two rules are already implied in these two, but I want to list them separately. The third one we can refer to as producer owns product. If I use my own physical body and something nature given that I originally appropriated, and then with the help of these two ingredients produce something additional, then I am the owner of what I have produced. Again, recall I mentioned something about production yesterday. Nothing is ever created out of nothing. Production is nothing else but transforming something that was less valuable into something that I expect to be more valuable than it was before. So the producer owns whatever he produces. And he can then do with whatever he has produced whatever he pleases. He can sell it, he can give it away as a present, he can let other people make use of it, or he can exclude other people from it. And the fourth rule is you can also acquire property by a contractual transfer from an earlier owner to a later owner. That is, whatever I have produced, whatever is mine, of course, in the form of a contract, an agreement, I can just give it away as a present, I can sell it to somebody else, and so forth. And people can acquire property from previous property owners. Now, before I go into a more detailed defense of these rules, an explanation of why these rules are rules of justice, so to speak, I just want to make you aware that intuitively it is very difficult to dispute these types of rules. Who else should be the owner of my own body except myself? Who else should own something except the one who has for the very first time done something to it? Somebody who did nothing to it? Somebody who just came 10 years later, 100 years later? Who else should be the owner of what he has produced except the producer himself? A person who has not produced it? Who else should acquire something except the person who has agreed with the previous owner, we will transfer ownership title to this thing from you? to somebody else. Yeah.
So according to this rationale, let's say in the real world, the Indians who were inhabitants of the Americas, they were not like using the resources. That's why they weren't the appropriate owners of this.
We might. I think it would be a good idea to just delay this a little bit until I finish the whole thing. But let me just say at least this. You see, the Indians definitely owned the animals that they hunted down. They definitely owned the berries that they picked off the bushes. Whether they actually owned ground land, that's a difficult question. Nomads obviously would not own ground land. They used ground land as a free good. That is, land existed for them, so to speak, in superabundance. Once they begin to become agriculturalists, that is, peasants, farmers, then they would own the ground land also. Once they begin to be herders, of having herds of animals and fencing certain pieces in so that the animals cannot run out and out, then definitely they would own the ground land also. And there existed Indian tribes that were settled, and there existed Indian tribes that were nomads, were not settled. So one would have to look in every instance, so to speak, what conditions are fulfilled in this particular situation. Just very quick to this principle. You realize that, or to illustrate, so to speak, how intuitively sensible this is, you realize that when little children, for instance, get into fights, that they also appeal to this principle. The kid says, "I played with the car first, and you came later. And once I drop the car, then it's fine. Then you can play with it. But as long as I'm here and I was the first one to play with the car, of course, I'm right, and you coming later, so to speak, are wrong." So even on the level of very primitive people, children are primitive people, of course. Remember my examples about children with that very high time preference that indicate children are very unique types. They appeal to this principle also. Okay, now I want to give a more rigorous defense. That is a justification for these rules. Intuition is nice and good, and it's always an advantage if our intuitions somehow support certain things, but it is not sufficient, of course. And I want to give first some sort of two approaches for a philosophical justification of these rules, and then I will just give an economic justification for these rules. For the first approach to justify these rules is to think about what would be the conceivable alternatives, and then try to show what is wrong with the alternatives to these rules. Now, to this principle, let me just look at this and this principle in print, because you realize that again the later two ones are already implied in the first two. So, what is the alternative that we have to self-ownership? And we can think of two alternatives. The first one would be simply a system of slavery. That is, I own you, I own your physical body, but you don't own mine. So I am the slave master, and you are the slave. You realize immediately this is a conceivable alternative to everybody owns himself, and nobody owns anybody else except himself. Now, what is the problem with slavery? slavery contradicts one of the fundamental principles of justice, that is the idea of principles of justice must be principles that are universalizable. We must be able to make them universal principles. The principle must apply to everyone in exactly the same way. This is also the idea that you have in the golden rule of ethics. Don't do unto others that you don't want to be done unto you. All people are equal. The same principles should apply to everyone. And it should be perfectly clear that the idea of slavery is, of course, a violation of the principle of universalizability, and it's a violation of the golden rule of ethics, because here we have two sets of rules. One set of rules that applies to the slave master, and then we have another set of rules that applies to the slave. We do not want to have ethical principles on the one hand that apply to women, so to speak, and another set of rules that applies to men. The principles must be universal. Otherwise, there would be no way that all people could possibly accept these rules as fair and just rules. So because of this, one alternative drops out. That's one alternative. And then there exists, logically speaking, only one other alternative to the idea of everybody owns his own physical body, and that is what we call universal communism. That is the idea of I own 1/30th of you, and you own 1/30th of me, or I own 1,000th of you, and you own 1,000th of me. Now you realize that this idea of universal communism is compatible with the idea of the same law should apply to everyone. The same rule applies to you. You own part of me, and I own a part of you. However, while it is compatible with the idea of the golden rule of ethics, or the idea of ethical principles have to be universalizable, it has a severe problem. For instance, if I wanted to do something, just like move from here to here, what would I need in order to do this if I'm only a part owner of myself? Keep in mind, you own part of me. So what would be necessary for me to do this? I would need your permission. After all, I'm not an exclusive owner of myself. If I'm an exclusive owner of myself, then of course I can move around. No problem. I don't have to ask you. But I'm not an exclusive owner of myself. I'm just a part owner. I need your permission. Can you give me your permission? Now, what is necessary in order to give permission? You would have to say, I permit you to do this. But can you say that? Well, the answer is no, you cannot say this, because are you an exclusive owner of your vocal cords, for instance? Are you an exclusive owner of your head? Are you exclusive owner of your brain? And the answer is, according to universal communism, you are not. So you could not even say, I permit you to do this because you are only a part owner of yourself. So if we would follow this principle of universal communism, then mankind would simply die out. Nobody could do anything because he needs permission for anything he wants to do, and nobody can give him permission because nobody owns himself. Nobody can even say anything without being the exclusive owner, for instance, of his vocal cords, of his brain, of his eyes, and so forth. what we recognize is this alternative can be put into practice. After all, slavery has existed all over the place for thousands of years. This one cannot even be put into practice. Mankind would never have started surviving, so to speak, if people had followed these principles. So now we are back then at this alternative. That's the only one that is compatible with the idea of everybody has the same rights, the same principles apply to everyone. It is universalizable. And secondly, mankind can survive if we do this sort of thing, if we follow this rule. And conflicts could be avoided. Take the second rule. What are the alternatives there? And again, in strict analogy to what I argued before, there are again two alternatives. The first is, I own what you have originally appropriated, but you don't own what I have originally appropriated. And what is the problem with that rule? Just the same one as with slavery. We would have two sets of rules applying to two categories of people. I am the owner of whatever I have appropriated, but I'm also the owner of what you have appropriated. Whereas you are not the owner of what you have appropriated, and you are not the owner of what I have appropriated. So this is a violation of the principle of universalizability. And what is the other alternative? The other alternative is we are all co-owners of what one particular person has originally appropriated. Now, what is the problem? If that were the case, that is, we all, even though I was the one who put to use for the very first time a piece of land, this piece of land is nonetheless owned by all of us. You only have to realize again what the purpose is of formulating these rules in the first place. That is, we have to just find a solution to the problem of conflicts. Are conflicts in any way avoided if we formulate this rule that we are all co-owners of what some particular person has originally appropriated, unless there is some sort of magic harmony of all interests? Conflicts will not be avoided by adopting this rule, but conflicts will be unavoidable. Anybody can now just say, this should be done with that should be done with that, this should be done, this should not be done, and so forth. And if we don't happen to agree, as if by magic, conflicts are there. And again, recall, no society can survive unless we have rules that allow us to avoid conflicts rather than generating them. And this rule of universal communism applied to rule number 2 would generate conflicts rather than avoid conflicts. Take number 3. Either we have, again, the producer, one producer owns what he has produced, but other producers do not own what they have produced. Then we have, again, this split between two different types of two different sets of rules. Or, again, we have universal communism. Everybody owns what other people have produced, which will not avoid conflict, but make conflicts completely unavoidable and permanent. So first, this is the first way to explain why these principles are, so to speak, justifiable, and the conceivable alternatives are not justifiable rules. In fact, they are rules that either lead to death or they lead to permanent conflict. They are contrary to the purpose of having rules in the first place. Now, very briefly, I want to just also show a second way of defending these rules. Recall the first insight that I tried to explain to you was ethical problems of right and wrong, only arise because things are scarce. If there would be no scarcity, we would not have any problems of deciding which is right and which is the wrong way to act. Only because conflicts exist does the question come up, is this right, is he right, or is he wrong in this situation? But besides conflicts, there is a second requirement that must be fulfilled in order to have ethical problems, to have problems of right and wrong. To see this, you only have to realize that we can have, of course, also conflicts with other entities, such as, let's say, mosquitoes or elephants or something like this. So a mosquito sits on my arm and bites me. I do not want the mosquito to sit there and bite me. There is a conflict of some sort at hand. Now, can I now begin to argue with the mosquito about whether he is entitled to do that or not entitled to do this, and then have a philosophical dispute about who is right and wrong and so forth? And the answer is, of course, no way. All I do in this situation is just slap it, and then the problem is solved. Or let's say an elephant comes and walks into your house. Can you then, and obviously there's a conflict, the guy destroys what you think is yours. Can you then talk to the guy? And,
you can try.
You can try, of course, yeah, but you will not get very far, obviously. So what we realize here is, yes, we also have conflicts with some entities where questions of right and wrong simply do not arise, that are merely a matter of technology, of technique. I have to learn how to deal with mosquitoes. I have to learn how to deal with elephants. Just as I have to learn how to deal with rain and sunshine and gravitational forces and whatever it is. They are part of nature, and my learning consists in learning how to deal with these types of entities. From that, the conclusion is, in order to have an ethical conflict, in order for the question right and wrong to arise, it is necessary that the entities with which we have conflicts must be rational entities. And how do we determine whether they are rational entities? We find out whether they are rational entities or not by discovering or not discovering that we can argue with them, that we can engage in propositional exchanges, that I can say something to you, no, you can't do this, and you can say, of course I can do that. I'm right and you are wrong. Give me your reasons and I will give you my reasons. If these entities that have conflicts cannot engage in argumentation at all, then we simply have no ethical conflicts with them. Then dealing with them is merely a matter of technology. You just have to learn how to deal with this. Fence them in, incarcerate them, kill them, tie them to some place, and so forth. Only if we can argue with them, does it make sense to talk about is this right and is that not right? And you realize that you cannot even deny that this is so. Because if you would say, no, you are crazy, that's not the way it is, that's not the solution to the problem, then you are already arguing. You can also not say it is not. How do you justify that you have to argue? Then you realize immediately that there is no justification for this has to be given. You cannot argue against arguing with other people. Now, what has this to do with this principle in particular? Now, if we argue with other people, arguing is not just free-floating sounds coming out of our mouths. Arguing, of course, requires also that I must have exclusive control over certain things. Over my brain, for instance, over my vocal cord, for instance, and so forth. But what we realize then is this. No one can deny without contradicting himself that everyone has a right to exclusively control his vocal cords, his brain, and by extension then other things that he can directly control. Because anyone who would deny this would contradict himself. Then he would simply have to shut up himself and would have to shut up himself forever. If I talk with you, then of course, by allowing you to say something back to me, and me saying something back to you, I take it for granted that I'm entitled to make exclusive use of my own body, and that he is entitled to make exclusive use of his body, and he then, by allowing me to talk back to him, again takes it for granted that I'm entitled to be the exclusive owner of my body, and so forth. So in other words, to deny this principle is impossible. Anybody who would deny that this principle is a valid, just principle contradicts himself because he himself must argue in favor of this principle. All right. This should be sufficient in order to give you a justification or a feeling of how these principles can be justified as ethical principles. What I want to do now is give you also an economic justification for these principles. I want to make the point that to the extent that we follow these rules and do not deviate from these rules, wealth in society will be maximized, will be greater than it otherwise would be. That should be obvious when it comes to rule number 1, or A. The only conceivable alternative, the only alternative that can be put into practice would be slavery, and slavery is an unproductive system. The slave does not have an incentive to be as productive as he would be if he were to own himself and own all the things that he produces. How about principle B? Now, if the first one, to put something to use that was previously unused entirely, would not be the owner of this resource, but the second one, or the third one, or all together, then, of course, the frequency of being someone who puts some resource for the very first time to use will be reduced. Again, recall, previously things were unearned. Original appropriation means somebody must have recognized there are interesting, useful things out there that have not been put to use, I'm the first one to put them to some use. If he knows that I will not be recognized as the exclusive owner of the things that I put to use for the first time, will he then put it to use? Either not at all, or at least not as frequently as he otherwise might. I can give you an example. Let's say I have the idea, or I know somehow from some information I've received that there is some valuable mine in Siberia. Now the question, I have to schlep out there to Siberia. I have to go there and appropriate the piece. Will I go there if I know that I will be recognized as the exclusive owner of it? Then I might. Will I go out there and put something to use that was previously unused at all if I know, no, I will not be recognized as the owner, or I will be recognized only as a part owner, or somebody else will be recognized as the owner, but not me? Then I will not do this. And obviously, this reduces the overall standard of living in society if less useful things are put to some use. Producer owns the product. What would be the case if the producer does not exclusively own the product? What is the incentive then to be productive, to produce something? The answer is either it is gone completely or at least it is diminished. If I don't own what I have produced, why should I then produce it? If I own only part of what I have produced, again, my incentive to be productive is obviously far less. This is, of course, what taxation is. Taxation is, of course, a punishment for people being productive. You are punished for producing something by having to pay half of it to some other people who have not produced it. No governments ever produce anything. They only take something away from those who have produced it, and thereby are, of course, a disincentive to be productive. Imagine the taxation rate would be 100%. What would then be your incentive to produce anything if you don't even own what you have done? Why should I then work? And of course, it should be perfectly clear what the consequence would be if people could also acquire property without having the agreement of those who have originally appropriated it or have produced it, if they can simply take it at will. There is in economics also what we call the Pareto rule. In order to increase what's called social welfare, because we cannot measure utility, it must be the case that at least one person gains from one activity and no one else loses from an activity. The first appropriator obviously gains from this activity, otherwise he would not have done it. Does he take anything away from other people? And the answer is, no, he does not take anything away from others. Other people could have appropriated, but they didn't. They didn't attach any value to it. There's just as many stuff around and nothing is taken away from them. One person is better off, no one is made worse off. The producer, if he produces something, obviously he himself is better off. Did he make other people worse off? The answer is, unless by producing something he damaged the property of others, and I'll come back to that. If he did not damage the property of others, he is made better off as a result of producing, and everybody owns exactly what they owned before. Everybody owns exactly the same consumer goods and producer goods as before, is not made worse off, the producer himself is made better off. And contractual relationships, the two partners that agree, that contract with each other, are made better off. Otherwise, the exchange would not even take place. Every voluntary exchange, every contractual exchange is characterized by the fact that both partners expect to benefit from the exchange, otherwise it would not take place. So two individuals are made better off, and everybody else in the world owns exactly what they owned before. Okay, now I want to add two clarifications to these principles that I explained. The first one is that people own property only in physical things. People do not own the value of their property, they own the physical integrity of their property. To give you an example, what I mean by this. Let's say somebody goes into the labor market, and then somebody else enters the labor market also. I want a job. And then somebody else comes and wants the same job as I have. What is the consequence of the value of your labor that can happen if somebody else applies for the same job? So it might go down. Or you go into the marriage market. So you are the only guy, and then some other guy comes along, and all of a sudden your chances go down the drain. The girl is no longer interested in you. So the value of yourself in the labor market is negatively affected by the existence of the second person. Has the second person aggressed? Has he committed a crime, so to speak, against the first one by lowering the value in the labor market or in the marriage market? The answer is no. He has not interfered with the physical integrity of myself or yourself. He has not done anything physically to you. He has only lowered the value, but has done nothing to your physical integrity. If, in this example of labor market and marriage market, I would beat the crap out of the other person, then obviously this would be a violation of property rights. He has physically damaged me.
What about reputation?
What?
What about reputation?
You can also not own reputation, because the reputation that you have is something that is in the minds of other people. You can try as much as you want to have a good reputation. That's true. But if you would own your reputation, that would basically mean you would have to own other people, because it is other people who give you the reputation or take the reputation away from you. I'll give you another example of that you only own the physical integrity of your property and not the value of it. You have a store and I open the same type of store right next to you. You have a grocery store and I open another grocery store. Now, it can very well be that the value of your store in the market will fall as a result of me opening another store and going into competition against you. Have I aggressed against you? The answer, no, I have not aggressed against you. If I then, because all the goods that you owned before you still own. All the goods are still on the shelves, nothing has happened to them. The value has gone down, but the physical integrity has been preserved. You realize, by the way, that if you were to own value of your property, conflicts would become, again, completely unavoidable. So you could somehow say, the mere fact that you exist somehow lowers my own self-esteem, lowers the value that I attach to myself. And then you could say the same to me. Well, I could say the same to you. The fact that you exist, that lowers my self-esteem tremendously. And then you say, yeah, but it's actually the other way around, that you exist, that lowers my self-esteem. And then somebody else comes, that lowers my self-esteem, and so forth. And there would be endless conflicts. So if people were to own the value of things, conflicts would be without any end. Only the physical integrity you own. If I damage your store, and as a result of damaging your store, the value falls, then the crime is the physical damage that occurred, not that the value fell. Okay. So this is the first addition to what I explained before, first clarification. Property exists only in physical things and not in the value of things. The second clarification is property is always acquired in the course of time. And sometimes we have to go into the history of the acquisition of property in order to decide who is right and who is wrong in some conflicts. Consider the following situation. So I'm the first person who appropriates this piece of land. I do something to this piece of land. And now I produce something, and as a result of my production, let's say, smoke is produced or dirt is produced, and the dirt lands outside of my property, but this area is not inhabited. Nobody lives there. And then somebody else comes. Now you arrive on the scene. And now you complain, look, you are violating my property rights because you physically damaged my property by sending out smoke or dirt from your property, which lands right here. Is he justified to complain about this? And the answer is no, he is not justified to complain about it, because what type of property did he appropriate when he moved there? He appropriated property that was already dirty. I did not damage anything. It was dirty. I have, in legal terms, because I was there first, I have an easement. I have previously already established my right to do this, and he is not entitled at all to complain about it, because whatever he appropriated was already of that kind. Frequently, by the way, of course, this is also because this then, the land is typically cheaper if some damage has occurred to it before. And if he acquired it cheaper, it would be somehow ridiculous to ask this guy, so to speak, to see to it that the value of this property goes up. On the other hand, if the situation is the other way around, that is, okay, here I'm first, and I have clean property, and then you come along, or I come along, and then begin to damage your property, can I then complain about this guy? Yes, then I can. I had acquired clean property, and then afterwards it was made dirty property by somebody else. I can ask him to stop that or to compensate me for the damage that he has done. So because property rights are acquired in time, there's a history of the acquisition of property rights. We have to go into the history how property rights are acquired in order to determine who is right and who is wrong in certain conflicts. As I said, this is what I explained here. This is, so to speak, the classical view that, again, people did not agree about all details and so forth, but if you look at judicial decisions and so forth, by and large, the courts decided property disputes in this way that I described. That's the traditional way that most people accept, that most people live by in their daily lives. And there has now developed in the last 50 years or so some strange alternative views to this view. And this strange alternative is associated in particular with the name of Ronald Coase. And also one of his better known pupils, Richard Posner. And this associated with the University of Chicago, even though Coase taught for most of his life at different places. And I want to explain this alternative view about what is right and what is wrong, how conflict should be decided, by taking a famous example that Coase discusses and various other people have discussed. And that example is, assume that there is a railroad and there is and this railroad, the engine emits sparks. And next to the railroad are fields, farming fields, and these sparks sometimes burn down the crop of the farmer. Now, who is right and who is wrong in this case? Can the farmer insist that the railroad owner has to stop this thing, or can the railroad continue doing these things? How is this conflict between the farmer and the railroad to be settled? Now, go back to the view that I explained just a minute ago. The classical view how to resolve this conflict is to ask the question, who was there first? If the farmer was there first, and then the railroad came along, and sparks were emitted from the railroad, and the crop was burning down, then, of course, the farmer is right. Then the farmer could say, look, you have to either compensate me for the damage that results as a result of your spark emission, or if you are not willing to just compensate me for it, I can just get an injunction against you and prohibit you from running your railroad entirely. On the other hand, if the railroad was there first and the farmer came later, then the situation is different. Then you would say, look, the railroad emitted sparks all along, the land next to the railroad was empty before, and the farmer appropriated land that was once in a while dirtied by these types of events, and there's no way that he can complain about it. He knew, so to speak, what he was getting into. So the classical view is who is right and who is wrong depends on who was there first and who came later. We have to go into the history of the case. Now, this is not the answer that Coase gives. His answer is very different, and I want to read you a quote from him and then explain this quote. He says, "It is wrong to think of the farmer and the railroad as either right or wrong, as aggressor or victim. The question is commonly thought of as one in which A inflicts harm on B, and what has to be decided is how should we restrain A. But this is wrong. We are dealing with a problem of reciprocal nature. To avoid the harm to B would be to inflict harm on A. The real question that has to be decided is, should A be allowed to harm B, or should B be allowed to harm A? The problem is to avoid the more serious harm." Let me just try to give you a drastic example to show how Coase thinks of this. If you just decide against the farmer, then he thinks you do damage to the farmer. If you decide against the railroad, you do harm to the railroad owner. And his idea is we have to somehow avoid whatever is considered to be the more serious harm. This following example to make perfectly clear how vicious this idea is. Let's say we apply this to the case of one person A is raping a person B. According to Coase, A, the rapist, is not necessarily guilty because we are dealing, again, I use his own words, we are dealing with a problem of reciprocal nature. Now, what does that mean in the rape case? It means if you prevent A from raping B, you inflict harm on A. The harm is that he cannot rape B. Okay? This is a harm is done to him. So in preventing A from raping B, harm is inflicted on A because he can no longer rape freely. The question is, and again, I always use his words. The question is, should A be allowed to rape B, or should B be allowed to prohibit A from raping him? Now again, the classical solution to this problem is you own your own physical body, and because of that, it's perfectly clear who the aggressor is and who the person is that is being aggressed upon. The raper is always guilty because he does something without the permission to a body that is owned by somebody else, but not according to Coase. The real question is, according to him, to avoid the more serious harm. Now, let me just construct an example to see what crazy consequences follow from this. So let's say the person who is raping has been a person that has been imprisoned for 20 years. He is now released from prison. He had no sex for 20 years. He is really sex hungry. To prevent him from having sex would be a serious harm inflicted on him. And let's assume that the person who is being raped is a professional prostitute. In that particular case, she might not want to agree to it because maybe his nose is too crooked or something like this, but that's her profession. So now she is being raped. So he wants now to determine what harm would be more serious. Would it be more serious to prohibit the rapist from raping the prostitute, or would it be more serious to do it the other way around? And in this case, we can easily say, look, I mean, it would be a tremendous harm that would occur to this poor imprisoned guy who can't have sex after abstinence of 20 years. And what a little harm is occurring to the prostitute. After all, that's her job that she does day in and day out. So in that case, we would simply decide, hey, of course, raping other people under special circumstances, if the circumstances are appropriate, that should be permitted. This is the view that Chicago economists have, and I want to give you other examples. I only chose now, of course, a very drastic example to make sure that you get the principle that is involved, but I will give you quotes now from them to show that this is a general view that they have, how we have to decide who is right and who is wrong. Never going into the history of the conflict, how property rights were acquired, but always judging, so to speak, for whom would it be more difficult, for whom would it be tougher, if he were found guilty or if somebody else were found guilty. Now, the principle that the Chicago people, Coase and Posner, want to defend is just is always what maximizes wealth. And whatever does not maximize wealth is unjust. Now I'll give you an example of what this means. This example is from Posner. Suppose a polluting factory lowers residential property values in an area by 2 million. That is because it pollutes, residential property values fall by 2 million. But that it would cost the factory $3 million to relocate to someplace else. So the damage is 2 million, and to relocate would be 3 million. On this basis, the factory prevails. Then the factory can stay and continue polluting because it would be more expensive for it to relocate rather as compared to the damage that is caused by the factory. Again, you realize they don't go into the history of the case. They do not decide was the factory there first and the residential area came later or the other way around. Now reverse the numbers. Again, this is direct quote. Now reverse the numbers. That is to say, the damage that occurs to the residential property values is 3 million, and the relocation cost is 2 million. In that case, Chicago judges would fight against the factory. Then they would say, look, the lowering of the residential values is 3 million, relocating is only 2 million, so you have to relocate. So depending, so to speak, on how they assess the damage and the cost of preventing the damage, they decide the case either in that way or they decide the case in the other way. Another example of how they would decide cases. Recall, just is what maximizes wealth, and unjust is what does not maximize wealth. So assume, for instance, that somebody doesn't do anything, that he's a bum who likes leisure, who likes doing nothing. What is the problem with a person like this if just is what maximizes wealth and unjust is what doesn't maximize wealth? Does this person behave in a just way? The person who doesn't do anything, who is just a bum. Yes, he is unjust. The Chicago people do not care whether he owns his own body and is free to do whatever he likes. No, he does something that does not maximize wealth. And they indeed go that far. They discuss, for instance, the following example. Imagine Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Company. If Henry Ford, let me see. First, before coming to this example here. So, again, a quote from Richard Posner in this case. If there is a taste for pure solitude, just to be alone, that is, for seclusion unrelated to social interaction, this is a selfish emotion. Solitary activity benefits only the actor. Work, on the other hand, confers benefits on others. There is thus a sense in which the person who works is unselfish, because he does something that is also good for others, while the individual who retires from the world reduces his contribution to the wealth of other people in society. So somebody who retires from the world is acting unjustly. And now to the Ford example. So imagine that Henry Ford had decided to become a Trappist monk. I don't know what Trappist monks, they just sit in a monastery and don't talk. I think they just are silent. Instead of having become the industrialist Henry Ford. Obviously, the consequence is that the American people would be poorer if Henry Ford had decided to become a Trappist monk rather than an automobile manufacturer. Now, what would then be justified to do in this view? That is, where people do not have fundamental rights to their own body, but only if you contribute something to increasing wealth are you acting justly, and if you don't contribute anything to increasing wealth, then you are acting unjustly, would be to enslave Ford, to take him out of the Trappist monastery and force him, hey Henry, you have to become an automobile manufacturer. You cannot choose to become a Trappist monk, because as a Trappist monk you act selfishly, you don't increase wealth, but as an automobile manufacturer you would increase wealth, and this is just and the other activity is unjust. Let me end on this note. Now ask yourself whether this goal that the Chicago economists have, namely to increase wealth, can be even accomplished if they do it like they say. Or if this activity of judges deciding, so to speak, who contributes more to wealth, who contributes less to wealth, I side with those who contribute more, I side against those who contribute less. If this would be made into a principle, then wealth would not even be maximized in society. Let me just give you this example. I decide, for instance, that he is a useless bum. All the money that he has in his wallet, he will just waste away drinking beer and vodka and Starka and whatever it is. Whereas on the other hand, I would wisely invest it and make big contribution to Lithuanian society, Lithuanian wealth, and so forth. In that case, I should be entitled to take his wallet out of his pocket, and I should be the owner of it. Okay, that might be all right. But now imagine that after a year, I turn into a worthless bum, and he has shaped up. And then he comes and says, look, you are a worthless bum, and I'm a great person. I would make a great fortune out of this. So I take the property away from you, and it is now again mine. What you realize is, if this is the principles that we apply, then property rights are never safe. Depending on changing circumstances, property would have to be given to her, or to him, and taken away from him and transferred to this person, and so forth. But if property rights are not permanently safe, but everybody has to be afraid, well, changing circumstances might lead to a different allocation of property, then of course there is no way that you can possibly increase wealth in society at all. So in a way, even though they say we want to allocate property in such a way that wealth is maximized, the way they go about it results precisely in the opposite effect. Because property rights need to be safe, and people have to know exactly in advance who owns what and who doesn't own what, in order for them to make long-range plans, rather than living under a scenario where nobody knows exactly what changed circumstances require in terms of redistribution of income. In the United States, courts have already decided in many cases according to Chicago principles. For instance, something like this occurred a year or two ago in Las Vegas. There was somebody who owned a house. And the city wanted to expropriate him. He went to court and said, how can you take my house away? I didn't do anything. I paid my taxes, all the rest of it. This is my house. I have inherited from previous generation, that inherited from the previous generation, and so forth. And then they said, no, but we want to use this piece of land for a different purpose, and there is a company that wants to have this piece of land, and they will build something on it that gives us far more tax revenue than we can earn from your lousy house that you have standing on this land, and because of that we take it away. That is, maximizing wealth is just, and not maximizing wealth like this lousy owner of a piece of land and house. He did not maximize wealth, so he was not deserving to be the owner of the house. As I said, this is all the vogue in economics. This is Coase is considered a big shot, and you are not supposed to say anything critical about him. I want to make you aware that this is, in some respects, worse than communism, and that this old-fashioned view that I presented before, that's the way, and the only way to go, the only way that property rights are from the very beginning defined, are absolutely clear for people, and the only way that in the long run wealth will indeed be maximized. Okay, with this I'll stop, and we'll take a break, and then I'll talk about this with Kate.